From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi again. Welcome to the show. Welcome to Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis. It would be easy to say that today we're going to talk about the environment, but in a sense, I think we're going to be talking about extraction today. The extraction of minerals and metals and fluids from the earth that ultimately heat our homes and make our smartphones and make modern life possible. But this is the earth, remember, and earth is governed by the laws of nature, so every action has a cost. And when the utility companies started building those big old power plants in the world's greatest cities more than a century ago, the miracle of electricity was so great that it just took most of the whole next century to acknowledge that combustion products of coal in our air are so deadly. So today we're switching to cheap, plentiful, and far cleaner natural gas, and we can breathe a little easier maybe, but can we drink the water after all that gas has been fracked out of the ground? And after all of those costs have been added up, that's for the next generation maybe, or maybe today, I don't know. Anyway, there's the other end of the process, trying to save, reuse, reprocess, maybe at least a part of the stuff we do use, some of it for only a few seconds, and then we discard it for hundreds of years into landfills. Well, two of Chicago's deepest thinkers about the environmental big picture are joining me today. People I've known for a long time, and I am just really happy to have them. Kari is back, Kari Lydersen. And the reason Kari's back so quickly is because in the whatever it's been, 5 or 6 weeks since the last time you were here, you managed to knock out a book. And it's a really interesting one. It's an e-book, and we'll have it up on chicagonewsroom.org a little bit later on today, and you can get that. We'll talk about it. It's called The Cloud Factories, talking about the coal plants. And also, Mr. Ken Dunn, one of the great, I would say, close to environmental heroes of Chicago, is joining us today. First time on the show, and I'm really glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Ken was a founder of the Resource Center, but that kind of only just begins to describe a little bit of it. Today, you're still in recycling. You've been Mr. Recycling in Chicago for decades, but now you're focusing more on the food piece of things and growing good and healthy food, and that's a worthwhile endeavor for sure. I know it sounds a little weird, but when I first saw the Cloud Factory, I thought there's this weird connection that I'm making to growing food healthily and attempting to recycle as much as we can of what we have, with mixed results, I'm sure Ken would say. And so I just thought that the two of you would be an interesting pair to have on the show, because we just want to kind of do a little bit of a status report. And Ken, since you're new here, we'll start with you. All right. I almost feel like this is an awkward question to ask for somebody who's been at this for so long, but in a global sense, national sense, I guess to some degree local sense, where are we at today in the process of attempting to reuse, repurpose, and recycle the stuff we throw away? Answer that in 30 seconds, and then we'll go from there.
I'd say we would score middling. There's a good attempt, but it has to be kept in mind that this isn't in the context of an industrial extraction economy. And it's probably the extraction that we should look at more than whether we reuse the materials again, because even the reusing requires energy, which requires power and requires fracking and all of that. So I think we have to not focus on one element towards moving towards a more sustainable society, but keep an eye on the prize where we not injure the planet and not extract to the extent that it injures our well-being on the planet.
This is part of the conversation that I know you and I have had a lot of times. As I said, every time I run into you, we end up talking for half an hour about something or other. But one of the great obvious things, I suppose, about attempting to reuse or recycle materials is that a lot of those materials require so much energy input to repurpose them into something else that it almost becomes a zero-sum game. And even worse, sometimes the effort to try to extract those materials from the polluted waste stream that they're in is another whole set of environmental nightmares. So should we give up?
No, these are good steps, and hopefully steps to become aware of the overall problem that we just have to back off on our consumption habits. That throughout history, people have had quality lives without so much extraction and polluting of the environment, and we can get to that too. There are wisdom that previous ages have that we don't have anymore. So we don't need all of the electricity and power and transportation that we consume. And so it's sort of a good thing to start reflecting on our consumption and how it really builds the quality of life. So we of course should, if we consume, do the best we can that the extraction doesn't do a second injury to the planet by depositing in a landfill somewhere. And there is almost universally slight gains by recycling. There's much less transportation, and there's less energy used in the repurposing, remaking paper into newspaper and glass into glass and aluminum into aluminum. So there are the advantages in the industrial process, but what we have to question is, do we need those industrial processes? Can we get our water from a well-treated Lake Michigan rather than shipping in bottles and cans from and over the place? Let's rethink our consumption.
Some of that stuff is just, if it weren't so sad, it would be really comical. I mean, think about the number of things that you come into contact with in a day that have a useful life cycle, as I mentioned earlier, of maybe 5 seconds. You know, a lid on a plastic soda cup or something that they serve it to you at the counter. You don't need a lid on it. You take the lid off, you throw it away. It had a useful life, if it was useful at all, of a couple of seconds, but it's going to be around for hundreds of years somewhere. So where are the successes, Ken? What materials, if any, are we really truly in some kind of an effective and efficient way being able to repurpose, let's say?
Well, paper is ideal in that it's sort of easy. It's recycling process. It enters another state being waterborne, so the contaminants are easily sorted out, including the ink, and you can put it back together as paper. And instead of harvesting forests in Canada or the Northwest to make our paper, we can turn paper back into paper. And there's a pretty good infrastructure. But then can we come up with new technology like e-books and news by electronic media?
And that's another advance that's happening. We talk a lot on this program about journalism and newsrooms and newspapers, but one of the just unvarnished good sides of it is that we're not going to be creating as much paper pulp for this anymore, the Dead Tree edition. I'm sorry to see it go away, but the other side of me is like, well, there's a real advantage there. Kari, I don't really even know what piece of the story is the best piece to tell about the closing of the basically 3 power plants in Chicago, right? Fisk and Crawford and State Line. It was a long, horrendous battle for many decades to get to the point where we are now. But what happens now?
Yeah, well, there is, in the most immediate sense, there's an ongoing process that's interesting about what will happen to those actual sites. And it's actually a pretty groundbreaking thing where there's this task force where the city and the local community groups are involved brainstorming and coming up with agreements about what they want to see on the site, although none of that is binding. So, you know, it may be that those plants just sit there forever. Ultimately, it'll be probably market forces that determine what happens with the sites. But in the bigger picture, one of the things that I think was, the 2 things that I think were so interesting about this story is, one, the larger energy and economic forces that played a huge role in the plant's closing, which is fracking and cheap natural gas, and also the growth of wind and other clean energy sources. And then these proposed EPA rules for old coal plants, which were announced last week, will just kind of probably accelerate some of those trends, you know, the growth of natural gas. Or, you know, across the country, really, especially the Midwest. So, you know, they're part of, I mean, that shift is ongoing. And then also one thing I really get into in the book is just the strategies and the dynamics of all the different groups of all different types working together. And it was a really remarkable coalition that came together to get the plants closed, or build the public and political will.
For many years.
Yeah. So that's something, and that actual coalition has, some members have continued to work together, and the whole big group has been somewhat dormant since then, but it definitely laid infrastructure and taught people lessons that will continue to surface in Chicago. And there's also organizations around the country looking at what happened with those coal plants. So whether it's fracking or any number of environmental and even non-environmental energy controversies or struggles that are going to keep arising. I think that campaign with the coal plants will continue to influence things that happen in Chicago in the future.
It is really amazing to me that so many coal plants remained and remain today online decades and decades after technology surpassed them, simply because I assume coal is cheap to extract from the ground and cheap to burn, and if you don't really care about what you're doing to the air, you can just continue to make money selling electricity out of these plants. I mean, I just don't quite understand it.
Yeah, and it's not even that it's necessarily cheap. It's just so much more complicated. And the coal from the Powder River Basin in Wisconsin is pretty cheap, and that's federally subsidized, and that's a whole other can of worms. The government isn't getting as much from the companies as it should for that Wyoming coal that is was being burned in the Chicago plants and is being burned in a lot of Midwestern plants. So in that sense, it's cheap, but they also are becoming more and more not economic. So that's one of the reasons these plants in Chicago closed, and then of course the government regulations play a huge role in how cheap coal is, because it's now that they are,
it's artificially low.
Yeah, but not now with different federal regulations kicking in, and even before these EPA carbon rules, and then that'll play a big role too. It actually won't be as cheap because they'll be forced to install different pollution controls if they want to keep running.
The place where you guys both intersect, I think, is human health, because clearly every technology has its health hazards that we all have to live with, but it's hard to think of anything that's more egregious than whatever those things were, half a megawatt, half a gigawatt practically of coal generation right smack in the middle of a major city, a really populated part of a city. It's almost an environmental crime by today's standards. If you tried to build one of those today, you'd be just laughed out of the... So health is a major piece of it, and health is a major piece of where you've come, Ken, which I find fascinating, is that you're really... your organization still is big and heavily into recycling, but your focus seems to be moving away from that and moving more into the how do we get food out of the ground that is not as polluted by all this crap that's in the air and in the water and everything else, right?
Yeah, I think we who are alive today face a real challenge that we've developed systems that are not good for the planet and not good for humans. And so sustainability becomes our major issue. And there's many elements of it. There are very improper uses of our resources, which harm the planet and harm people. But we've sort of, in the sustainability movement connected to avoiding global warming, which could be the end of human life on the planet, we've got a real ticket for unification. We can find the common elements that are important to all of humanity, and how can we work together on that? And so among the things we need to do is get rid of inappropriate technology that are clearly bad for the planet, like coal burning for our energy. But then, as you indicated in your introduction, maybe we should even consider what we're replacing it with, fracking and cheap natural gas. So could we really consider going back to using less energy, using more human power to get around? I noticed you came here by bike.
Yeah, happy Bike to Work Week, by the way, yeah.
So we have kind of a unique opportunity now to unify all these minor issues. Recycling was a minor adjustment to the industrial technology. The industrial technology is something we really have to reconsider. and we have to reconsider how money calls all the shots. We tolerated these coal plants as long as they were making plenty of money and putting in plenty of promotions to make us ignore the problem. So it's time for us to get beyond the presentations that are made by the various aspects of our modern society and rethink directly what are the elements of quality of life on this planet. And the consumption of energy as we do it, the extraction of resources and redepositing just can't be sustained. We just have to
I think it needs to be noted at this point, though, that we are also at a very positive junction where energy use, I would imagine, per capita, at least certainly in the United States, is probably going down because of the efficiency of lighting, which is just a major development in the last 5 years, even with LED technology. A lot of just the things we've been talking about, that our methods of communication, our methods of transportation are becoming more and more efficient all the time. So we are probably using fewer, watt hours per person, but we just keep finding all these new things that we want to do, all these amazing new technologies. So, instead of one clunky old television, we've got 5 or 6 screens in our house that we have to power up. So it just keeps going.
I think one way, just to tie the things together too, that I think, like, say Ken's doing urban gardens, and you talk about energy innovation and getting more efficient, and one of the really exciting things with energy is just distributed, micro people having obviously solar panels and even small wind turbines, and like say in Pilsen, that's a perfect example where these coal plants were sort of imposed on the neighborhood. Although they were built so long ago, the neighborhood also grew up around them. But a lot of these dirty industries and power plants are something that are just put in a neighborhood without people having a lot of say over it. And then I think things like doing the urban gardens and people creating their own energy sources or doing creative, like building reuse projects, are a way that people are really kind of reclaiming their own space and remaking it in kind of a healthy way that at least symbolically, if not concretely, provides like a counterforce to the, and that's, you see that actually with the discussion around the coal plant sites. Like, they talk about doing parks and gardens there, and they've made it really clear that they do not want any more heavy industry or big box store or anything like that on those coal plant sites.
But at the same time, we don't have the jobs that we used to have. So, I mean, there's that whole thing figures into it too. And it's a kind of a hard sell sometimes to tell the American people that they need to do more with less when they're feeling squeezed in an economic and political sense. And that is I think that's the challenge of our time, is that it's just not as easy as it might have once been anyway, to just say, oh, I'll do without that. I don't know. I mean, I'm getting really confused about the whole thing as we move along, because there are so many different angles to it where I hear, 3 of us sitting here saying, well, we have to just economize. We have to use less power. We have to extract more from the earth. But, tell that to somebody who hasn't had as much extracted from the earth for them, right? They look at everybody else who has everything else, and we're seeing that globally, of course, with the rise of new nations that are making these demands. And that's why I needed to call you guys in, because sometimes I just kind of like hit an emotional wall, and it's like, well, I just don't know how we're going to do this, because it seems to me that there really is a finite level of how much we can take out of this planet, and there are more and more of us trying to do it, and we're doing it more and more efficiently. And nowhere is that more visible, I think, than in the fracking system, where suddenly you have this miraculous, worldwide cheap glut of an amazing fuel, but we're just not paying the slightest bit of attention to the price we're paying to extract it out of the ground, or at least we're not paying as much attention. And the next generation of Karis and Kens are going to be out there fighting about that, probably.
Well, I think both with fracking and with talking about energy use and whether people have to do more, have to settle for less. I mean, I think that's where really just smart planning and really strong government oversight is so important, because with energy, I mean, people could, if we had a much smarter energy system, people wouldn't necessarily have to, you can just make so many efficiency gains. I mean, the European countries have done so much to use a lot less energy without cutting back at all on their quality of life or what they're actually able to do. And then same with fracking. I mean, there's, at the very least, if we were to have strong regulations and the best science and transparency, you could do fracking in a much less destructive way than it's going to be done if there's, if it's a free-for-all. But I mean, you need to have a strong government and a public willing to back up the government.
But then I look at governments like Canada, which I consider to be a fairly, fairly enlightened and progressive government, and I look at what they've allowed to happen in Alberta, where they've essentially stripped, as we've mentioned many times, they've deforested an area of their country that's bigger than Florida, so that they can get at some of the worst crap in the earth, this tar sands, and by the way, ship it down to us, so we'll refine it on the shores of Lake Michigan. Right. And you just have to ask, at what price are we doing these things? But of course, the problem is there's no sweet, clear oil flowing out of the sands of Saudi Arabia anymore, at least the way it was, and so it's harder to get at this stuff.
It's useful to put this in perspective, like the question of what can we tweak to get to where we want to be, and I think the answer is nothing. We just
can't tweak it.
Yeah, you can't change from one energy source to another. It is assumed, or it's been postulated, that the safe carrying capacity of our planet is about 1/5 the population that we now have. And it's only a small portion of the inhabitants of the planet that are so absorbent as we are. So we're going to have to learn what humanity did in past times, having quality cultures, just consuming less energy in all forms, transportation, home heating, home cooling, and so what we have to do is unify around a quality of life that isn't based on us being everywhere.
Well, you see, this gets us, doesn't it, to the big issue, because I can remember going to teach-ins up at Northwestern in 1967 with Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb and all this, and saying very confidently that we already have way too many people on the planet, and if we stopped today, we still wouldn't be able to carry this planet forth. Well, a lot of what would we call them, politically conservative thinkers, just debunked that and said it's absolutely nonsense, because it's all a matter of the economy. And when the economy works, you can find new sources of energy, you can find new products, and you can support millions, billions more people on the earth. And for the next 20 or 30 years, it looked like maybe they were right. And now today, I find myself looking at this again and saying, no, there's physics involved here, right? I mean, there's laws of economics, but there's also laws of physics, and the laws of physics are much less rigid, or more rigid than the laws of economics. When there is no more of this hydrocarbon available, then there is going to be a reorganization of some kind that is going to be massive. And it feels to me like we might be on the precipice of that, although I felt that way 20 years ago, and of course new technologies always do seem to come along. But how much more of this is there, and I'll address this more to Ken. Are you and I just two old guys who are just kind of like getting more and more cynical about this, or are we actually onto something here?
I think we've chosen to be as observant as we can of what are the realities in the modern age, and as honest as possible as what the solutions are. And I think we can't use solutions that have been around and solving problems the last couple hundred years. More technology, more science, and so we have to just totally reverse our thinking process, and let's devise systems that support the human being. And the other thing about sustainability we have to bring in is not only are we ruining the planet, but the relations among peoples are greatly deteriorating because of this race for the last drop of petroleum and all the energy we require to sustain our lifestyle. So it's time for us to think both on the human relations side, how can we become at peace with all the population of the planet, and how can we come to terms with being at peace with the planet. And I think it's starting again of what a human being needs and where does its pleasures come from, and build on that. Can we find a way to supply the needs of a human being and its pleasures?
Human being thinks it needs everything that its 10 fingers are capable of grabbing and pulling toward it. That's become my view. But and by the way, the water wars haven't even begun yet. We may not be alive to see those wars, but those are going to be the most vicious of them all. Kari, take the last couple of minutes here and talk politics for us, okay? Because it's all politics. I mean, it really is. It's all politics. Your ebook, The Cloud Factory, just does such a great job of talking about the betrayals and the undercutting and the backroom deals and the backstabbing. And you know how we had a mayor Mayor Daley, who liked to call himself the greenest city mayor of all times, and yet had this complete blind spot about the biggest power polluters in the country sitting right in his city, and he never did anything about it. But Blagojevich actually did do some things about it, so it's fascinating.
Yeah, the really quick version of all the politics that figure into the coal plants. Blagojevich did actually broker these agreements that were among the best in the country for a coal-heavy state like Illinois that did force the power plants. There was individual agreements with different companies that did force the power plants to reduce their emissions, and that ultimately was one of the major things that caused them to close, because they were facing these deadlines to install pollution control technology. And then you had Danny Solis, the alderman in Pilsen, was kind of along with Daley the epitome of just going with the political winds. He was totally recalcitrant on these coal plants, in the face of massive community opposition for a long time. And then when he was facing a runoff where the coal plants became an issue, he miraculously
where the community stood up to him and put him in a runoff. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So he switched, and now he's the biggest proponent of, being proud of closing the coal plants. And then Rahm Emanuel, the mayor, ultimately kind of brokered the agreement that led to them closing, although the dark side of that was, on one hand, they would have closed anyway, and the agreement led to a lawsuit being dropped against some of Midwest Generation's other coal plants.
Right.
So it was
the
complicated.
bargain there was a very complicated bargain, and it wasn't all for good.
Right.
And that's the thing about it that I guess that leaves the position I end up with on this is that market forces closed those coal plants. They ran them irresponsibly and in a dirty fashion, like an old beater, like as someone quoted in your book, like an old 50 Chevy that they're just going to run it for a few more years until the thing just completely crashes, and then they'll walk away from them. And that's essentially what they did, because it just they weren't making any money on those plants anymore. There were cheap and very much more efficient fracked gas plants that drove them out of business.
Yeah, and if I can mention real quickly, if anyone wants to continue this conversation, we're actually having an event and discussion in Pilsen on Monday, June 16th at 7 p.m. at 2005 South Blue Island. So if anyone wants to keep
We'll
talking.
put that on the website.
Thank you.
We've run way over, as of course I knew we would. Thank you, Kari. Thank you, Ken, so much. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV. You can watch us anytime, and you can also see us on YouTube right here, and you can hear us on iTunes, and I hope that you will do that. Thank you so much. A little bit late. See you next week with another show here on Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis. Bye now.